All right, everyone. Greetings. My name is Taya Bolton, and I want to welcome you back to another episode of Aspire Conversations. We are here today to talk about the intersection of race relations, politics, and business. We have some really important people here to share with you today. This was born out of the Black Lives Matter movement because of Aspire's position in the community as a nonprofit serving small businesses. We decided to do a Black Businesses Matter movement. So we're bringing together policymakers, decision makers, small business owners, and other community leaders to make sure that we are having communications that are well-rounded, that everyone who needs to be at the seat has a seat, that you have an opportunity to contribute by being on Facebook Live with us, and we appreciate you spending your time with us. This web-based series is going to go through February 2021. You can visit aspirecommunitycapital.org/Aspire Conversations to learn more, to read our solidarity statement, and to get involved in other ways. So I want to welcome you again to another session. Again, I'm Taya. I'm the producer of this series, and I'm super excited to let the conversation unfold today. It might be slightly uncomfortable, but it's going to be exactly what we need to have in the community, okay? So without any further ado, I want to go ahead and get things turned over to our CEO, Manuel Campbell, who is also going to be our moderator for today. So Manuel, over to you.
And thank you, Taya. And I greatly appreciate all the panelists who have joined us today. I think we have an excellent group of thought leaders who are participating on this panel. And I'm just really excited about just really having an engaging and genuine conversation around the intersection of race relations, politics, and business in Charlotte. I have Dan Roselli of Packard Place, Shama Haynes of Westside Education Think Tank, and Khalif Rose of the Rhodes Firm. And Khalif, since we're celebrating your 32nd birthday today, we'll let you kind of start off and just kind of give a brief introduction.
Well, I appreciate that, and 32 would be great. I'll be short, and I think I'm a former college professor, so for me, it's the best for me to answer questions in terms of what you or the audience is wanting. But I'll say I'm the chair of the Black Political Caucus here in Charlotte. As well, I'm an attorney where prior to me being the chief magistrate of Mecklenburg County, I was in private practice where I handle mergers, acquisitions, corporate compliance, and due diligence. Now the majority of my practice is personal injury matters. And so I'm excited to be here. I think the topics that we're talking about today are very important. And so I'm ready for an exciting conversation.
And Dan, would you mind going next?
Yeah, Dan Roselli, founder of Packard Place, the Entrepreneurship Center in Uptown Charlotte. Also, our accelerator programs and venture fund, been a big supporter of the entrepreneurial and tech community in Charlotte for quite a while. And part of Packard Place's mission has always been to bring the community kind of writ large together. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Shama Haynes.
Thank you. I'm Shama Haynes. I'm the founder and project leader for the Westside Education Think Tank. The Westside Education Think Tank was born out of the idea that the community needed a vehicle to express educational concerns as well as a vehicle to solve problems in education on the West Side. Many people believe that the Westside Education Think Tank's sole focus is on equity. It actually isn't. Our sole focus is on the community itself and how we can be a bridge and what we can do to challenge the system, and also what we can do to bring solutions to the system. So with that being said, this is a wonderful conversation, and I thank you guys for inviting me into it. Thank you.
Excellent. And Shamar, I'd love to kind of extend that what you really focused on and what you really talked about with respect to somewhat of the mission of the Westside Education Think Tank. And, you know, as we kind of thought through the topics for these Aspire conversations, and we came up with this one, we just thought that it would be an excellent opportunity to bring in amazing panelists such as yourself. But as we really think about it, you know, we were somewhat presumptuous in coming up with this subject, because is there really an intersection of race relations, politics, and business in Charlotte? And if so, what's really guiding that intersection?
Do I have permission to speak?
Oh, please do.
For me, the more that I get information about education, this is something else. I'm not an educator. I'm not an
Mm-hmm.
employee of the school system, nothing like that. I became involved as a parent and a person of concern. And so
Mm-hmm.
from my perspective, it's taken a long time for me to really understand the inner workings of the education system and where African Americans truly exist in this system. And so from my perspective, they intersect. And the intersection is not really to name education or business or politics. The intersection really is, how do we eliminate poverty in our community? And so when we ask that question, then all of these other things come up. Okay, well, in order to eliminate poverty, we have to get political capital. In
Mm-hmm.
order
Mm-hmm.
to eliminate poverty, we have to get people educated. We have to get people to understand where, quite honestly, white supremacy has really taken our community to a point that Black people are stuck in poverty. And if we could actually bring our people out of poverty, that would solve a lot of the problems. But then you have to break down, it's like a big onion. You just got to keep peeling back and peeling back. And every time you peel something back, you figure
Mm-hmm.
out, okay, here's another layer. And so
Mm-hmm.
this conversation about intersection is so very important because in it's a big onion.
Mm-hmm.
In order to get people out of poverty, in order for us to really be able to build wealth and establish wealth and gain the type of political and social capital that we need, we have to have these conversations.
Absolutely. And Khalif, in particular, kind of given your role as chair of the Black Political Caucus, how do you perceive kind of that intersection of race relations, politics, and business here in Charlotte?
I mean, they're intricately connected. I mean, they're about as connected as two different colors of sand. If you throw them together, you can't separate them. And I think Dr. King, back in the '60s, when they did the Poor People's Campaign, I think was onto something where he recognized that, okay, we're marching for civil rights, but if folks don't have a living wage where they can
Mm-hmm.
pay for things like food and groceries and pay their rent, then we have bigger problems than just allowing folks to eat at a counter and ride on a bus. And so when they got to the root cause of it, they truly recognized then that politics and income were directly connected. I think we're still at that intersection. While we're not
Mm-hmm.
facing the Bull Connors or the George Wallaces of the day, where you have folks that were outwardly as elected officials attempting to overtly deny folks their individual civil rights and deny them access to those income making opportunities. What we do have is the remnants and the connections, the secondary effects of a history and a historic systemic systems that were created to stop folks from getting access to those things. And so for me, politics and business are directly connected. Politics and race are directly connected, and race and business are connected. At some point, again, I don't like to take up the whole time, but I looked at the disparity study that Mecklenburg County put out this month. And if you look at that study, it's alarming. And so I think we all can say we've looked at 1 billion disparity studies, but when you get folks in the right place that actually take issue with those disparity studies and say, okay, now enough is enough. Mecklenburg County is made up of 33% African Americans, but they only receive 9% of the contracts. $1 billion in contracts, prime contracts went out from Mecklenburg County, 1 billion. So the total minority inclusion in that was only 11%. That's 120 million. So you're telling me that only $120 million went to these minorities, and that's all of them. So Asians, Hispanics, and African Americans, that are all included in those minority women business enterprises. So for me, it's always where the dollars are, and it for me connects to race. But you have to have folks elected in those positions that take issue with it, so then they can say, how can we change that? Even if we got to the 33%, I'd be moved in a positive manner. But I think we should reach for higher goals when we're talking about that, because it directly connects to our wealth distribution. White households average wealth 140,000. African American households average wealth 12,000. Those numbers don't lie. They tell a telling story of folks that are trying to figure out where they fit in a society that hasn't figured out where they fit. So.
Mhm. And Dan, I saw you nodding your head throughout both Shamaya's and Khalif's responses. Anything you would like to add?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. The connection of business and race, there's no question it's connected. I'll use a business analogy to talk about that for a second. One of the really good business books, Jim Collins on Good to Great, studied the best, in theory, CEOs. And one of the things he talked about, exceptional business leadership, is a seemingly conflicting concept of level 5 leadership, which is I have a brutally hard, honest reality of the facts as they are, not as I want them to be. And at the same time, I have a belief in the team and the resources that we can overcome it. That is a fantastic analogy for race and business relations in America, because I don't think that most of white America has come to terms with the reality of race in America. And some of the comments that were made earlier about income disparity and the ability to create wealth, I think most white Americans believe America is the land of opportunity and it's a level playing field.
Mhm.
And we know it's not. People that are aware that level 5 concept of the facts as they are, not as we want them to be. No one wants to see themselves as racist, or very, very few people want to see themselves as racist. And most of the people that are perpetuating systematic racism, I assure you, don't see themselves as racist. And that's part of the problem. If we can't get to the reality of the situation, we will never be able to fix it. That's why conversations like this have to happen. And I'll add one last thought for you, because we're trying to talk about the intersection of business and race. I was at a Charlotte Chamber of Commerce when it was still the Chamber 3 years ago at one of the retreats, and Hugh McCall and Harvey Gantt were on stage talking about how business and race are intersecting. And Hugh, I think it was, made one of the most insightful comments, which is the racism, a lot of the racism in America today is the racism of indifference. It's not people putting on white cloaks and burning crosses. It's there's tens of millions of white Americans that haven't reached that empathy level to be able to understand the reality as it is versus how sometimes it's taught to them.
Dan, I think if I may, real quick, Dan, I think that's an excellent point. My wife, she's an executive recruiter, and she's has a business that actually recruits folks. And so in that space, I hear those conversations. Folks hire people that they're comfortable with. So if we're not even talking about like, wealth creation, but even in just basic business principles, if I'm making a decision of hiring someone to do a job, I'm going to first figure out, well, are they able to do the job? And then who am I most comfortable with? So even if you're looking at those implicit biases that folks work with on a daily basis and try to fight against, if you're super comfortable with someone that looks like you and speaks like you and talks like you and thinks like you, then that's the hiring decision that you'll make. But it takes folks that make those decisions to think outside of the box and understand that diversity is something that enhances your organization as opposed to deduct from it, is where you have that next level growth, like John C. Maxwell talks about as well, those 5 levels of leadership. You have a level 5 leader when you can start talking about how do I develop folks that are not in my comfort zone. So I totally agree. And then the last thing I say is, Dan, in that tech space, being a fintech company, that's I think the next step for specifically in African Americans, as they're attempting to try to make up ground that they have lost over the years. That tech space is a huge opportunity, and it's devoid of an African American voice. It's devoid of a woman's voice. It's a predominantly white male dominated space, and so in that space, I see great opportunity where folks can take advantage of it if they can just figure out how they can manipulate, or I should say, jump over some hurdles that have been placed in front of them. But by all means, I think that what you hit on earlier was dead on point.
Please, Shama.
What I will add to that is when I'm not out in the community and in the Black Political Caucus meetings and everywhere else that I go all over the city, I actually work for a major company here in Charlotte. And prior to that, I've held many corporate positions. And I think what we miss here is people like to use the word diversity, but I have come away from using the word diversity. because all it is it just means a sense of being diverse. It has no action behind it. It has nothing to say that we want to do more than just be diverse.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the mindset of corporate executives and how they and I don't want to say that people are intentionally being racist, but they receive reports around who's in management, who's making the money, who's doing what, and there's just slow motion in terms of developing African American leadership within these corporate structures. I want to say that it's not intentional, but I can say this: if we know and we have the information and the knowledge, then we need not be talking about diversity. We need to be talking about intentionality. We need to be talking about building opportunity. And those discussions just don't take place anymore. When affirmative action got shot down, it was the worst blow
Mm-hmm.
to African Americans in this country. Because at the end of the day, I was around when the tail end of affirmative action was around. And we would have, there was lots of talk about it because people wanted to get rid of it. Most of the African American executives that actually made it through that program had to be twice as good as anybody else just to
Mm-hmm.
prove that they were even on the level of
Mm-hmm.
being a part of the affirmative action program. I think that we could say that for the corporate side of things. The other side of it is we really need to focus more as a country on supporting Black businesses, smaller businesses, and businesses that may not necessarily be buttoned up tightly and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I look at the majority of Black businesses that I support, and I say, well, if the person doesn't have a nice cash register yet, I'm going to still support it, because eventually, if I keep supporting, they will rise to that level. We've got to understand that as we speak about what we're not being given and the opportunities that we don't have, we also need to look as an African American community into the things that we do have. We
Mm-hmm.
have a small amount of wealth, but what do we do with that small amount of wealth? When we have the opportunity to hire for positions, do we hire for potential? And do we look into another African American person's experiences, or do we go with that other person because we ourselves are comfortable with that other
Mm-hmm.
person?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not I'm in alignment with what everybody else has said, but I also challenge this thing of, we live in the wealthiest country in America. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, African Americans have a great amount of mountains to climb. We absolutely do. There's no denial there. But what I have a strong desire for is to see the to see where we even have what we have and we share it amongst each other. If
Mm-hmm.
we just did a certain amount of business amongst each other, if we just
Mm-hmm.
made a pact to hire each other, if we
Mm-hmm.
just made a pact to support each other, how far
Mm-hmm.
could that get us in this climate? And I know that's not really the talk for today, but I will say we should consider buy Black, hire Black, and not be afraid to hire back Black and buy Black.
And Shama, I greatly appreciate that insight, because I think that that is a segment of the population that we really don't lend our support to in the way that we should. And one of the ways that I think that really feeds into the narrative of this discussion is, we're definitely in voting season, and everybody, and there are all kind of campaigns. And Dan, I appreciate your background, and we thank you for all your work in the space. But typically in this environment, we have a lot of people telling us what they're going to do, and there's very little conversation about what we want them to do. And so as we kind of discuss this, the intersection of really kind of thinking about the intersection of both race relations, politics, and business, what might be the one or two policies that we would ask of our policymakers, be it local, state, or on the federal level, that would directly affect small businesses in our community?
Wow, I've been dying to say something, but I'm gonna let Khalif take this one.
and then we're not leaving you out. So please, this is.
I'm not a shy guy. Don't worry.
Dan, if you want to jump in, go ahead. I'll defer. That's fine.
I'll make one quick comment, which is for me, I think two things that should happen. I think Election Day ought to be a national holiday, right? If we want to honor people like Martin Luther King's legacy, in my opinion, make it a national day. It should be something that everyone has the opportunity to participate in. And the part of the dirty little secret is the 1% in power. They understand the power of disenfranchising people to vote. They don't talk about it except when they slip up. They absolutely understand the only way they stay in power is to disenfranchise people of color, people of different economic class from voting. That is the dirty little secret that the people in power will not tell you. It is absolutely true. The second thing, if I could do two other things, I'd make the minimum wage a livable minimum wage. This whole idea that this American dream that a lot of the people that are those racism of indifference or lack of empathy say, well, you know, it's America. All you got to do is work hard, keep down a job, keep your nose clean, you know, and you should be fine. That is not true. If you work a job in America, that you have to work two jobs, and then what do you do? And you're not able to help spend time at home or do other issues. There is a false belief that this concept of the American dream is there. It's not when you don't have a family supporting livable wage where you can hold down a job, do a great job in that job, and be able to put a roof over your family's head and food on the table and spend time with your family. That does not exist. And I don't think a lot of people acknowledge that.
Everything Dan said, 100%, 1000%. Seriously, I mean, the affordable and living wage is something that I think has been an argument that folks have talked about for a long time. And even if they fight to get to those numbers, by the time they get there, that won't even be a living wage. I mean, the consensus has been $15 an hour. Congresswoman Adams has been pushing that. A number of other folks have been pushing that in terms of having a national increase to that amount. I think on the business side, folks like Amazon and other companies have already taken it upon themselves, and Walmart, to say, okay, we'll align ourselves with that $15 an hour. But as inflation obviously increases, as these companies, these areas like Mecklenburg County and San Francisco and New York, the cost of living is extremely exponentially increasing. What I can say is $15 an hour still won't make it. It will obviously be better than the $7 an hour that someone's making, $7.15, but it 15 is just still not enough. And so I can say that I am all in anybody increasing that livable wage. And I'm also thinking about it from a business standpoint. How can a business be productive and still be able to pay those types of wages? And so it takes folks to be innovative about that. Nobody ever wants to have that conversation, but I'm a businessman. At the end of the day, I help a lot of my clients are businesses. And so if you are a business, not a nonprofit business, but if you are a business, your number one goal is to make money. And so figuring out ways to ensure that you can have employees that are able to take care of their families and still, get the job done and make sure your bottom line is there. That's not an easy conversation. Folks make it seem like it's just easy, pay them that money. It's not. And so I know those are delicate conversations that have to happen. But again, you have to have folks that are open and willing to have that conversation. But you mentioned something before about candidates listening and us, not having something to say to those folks. I think during our discussions this year, the caucus obviously puts out an endorsement list of folks that we as an organization have supported and that we're asking folks to go to the polls and vote for. We had 165 plus candidates that we looked at, interviewed all of those folks. And what I can say is this year, I think unlike other years, folks are listening more. And so it's imperative on us as an organization and as a people, even though we're not a monolith and we don't think the same and don't have one, unique thought process, we still have to have an agenda. Whatever that Black agenda is has to be conveyed to those folks. And then there's accountability part. And so those asked specific questions have to be not general, but specific to what you're looking for. So a candidate can either run and take it, or they can disregard it. And so when it's time to vote for those folks again in 2 years or 4 years, you can say, hey, remember when you came to us and you said that you would do X, Y, and Z and you didn't. So I think they, again, that intersection of politics and business, they connect again. You have this person that has an opportunity that once they're elected, say on the city council or county commission, to give a number of dollars to your specific part of town, and then they don't. That for me is an accountability thing where you can say, well, hey, why didn't that money come here? What you have to be able to tell us why. And if you can't explain to us why, and if that voter base that you actually neglected helped you get elected, then that's where I think there's problems for you going forward. And in the past, I don't think those types of conversations were happening where folks were, they are frustrated, but they're not mobilized in a way where they can say, listen, now my frustration will result in you not being elected.
I got something to say, and I promise y'all I'm gonna be very brief. What I'm gonna say is a lot more radical than what both Khalif and Dan said, but y'all can always count on me to come up with something. There are a couple of things I want to say before I get into my main point. What I want to tell you guys is that as educated as I seem to be sometimes on things, here's something that I'm just wrestling with this year. And me and Khalif may have talked about this before. African Americans must engage again in the two-party system. And here's why. As an independent voter, I have cheated myself out of the ability to actually lead in the party that I vote most likely with. What that looks like is having precinct executives and chairs and people who are actually, who have that ability to mobilize the community. But what it also does is in the political party itself, it gives you a line of communication to where you can help to set the party's agenda. How long has it been since African Americans have actually set the party agenda for either party? We get the remnants of what everybody else's thought processes are because we live in this country and we exist in this country. But I want to see Black people come into power in these two political systems, two political parties. And I say two political parties because as it stands right now, we have the Democrats who will most likely give us the things that we desire. And then we have the Republicans who kind of just brush us off and say, well, we're not going to get you anyway. So it's better for us to just go this total opposite way of not giving you anything you desire. And so we need to push our folks in the direction of, it's great to be independent, but at the same time, you lose the ability to have a thought process in the party itself. As far as policy, I really do believe that we can dance around a lot of stuff and say, hey, living wage, this and that. I'm moving towards two things with this. One, a guaranteed wage to every household in America. Because my mother, we were very poor growing up, and she was on welfare. But one thing that she was able to do was spend her time raising her children. She wasn't working 50 and 60 hours a week and still just to be poor. That's what we've created now without some sort of guaranteed wage. And I'm not saying that it didn't have its drawbacks, but I can't see where people have really benefited from this whole welfare to work thing. And in addition, now they don't have time or money. And that's why we see children who are unsupervised and children who are going to school ill-prepared in record numbers. The other thing is, the top of the list is, we need to determine in this country for ourselves and for the betterment of those who suffered, whose descendants suffered through slavery, we need reparations for Black people. We need the full restoration and we need full restoration of our communities. And it doesn't matter if you give us $15 an hour or $23 an hour, we can't catch up to hundreds of years of oppression. We need a leg up, and I am not ashamed to say that we need a leg up. We worked all that time for free. We still suffer through Jim Crow. 40 years of freedom ain't long enough for us to produce the results that we need to produce for our children and grandchildren. So for me, top of the list is reparations specifically for descendants of slaves, and also guaranteed health care and money for every household in America.
And thank you all. I appreciate that insight. Very, very, very enlightening from my standpoint. And Khalif, I just want to throw out there that nonprofits are actually, we run those as businesses as well.
Yep.
So,
Oh,
so
for sure.
I appreciate
For
that.
sure. No, and I just want to clarify. I mean, I've assisted a number of nonprofits. The issue with the nonprofits at the end of the year, your books have to be cleared out. And so
Right.
that cash flow and carryover, where any other
Right.
type of business, for-profit business, I'm trying to grow their bottom line. And that next year, we're trying to get them where it's compounding. There is no
Right.
compound with a nonprofit because it's disappearing.
Right.
But by all
Absolutely.
means, I would hope you guys run it and operate it like a business for sure. For sure.
Yeah, certainly. And I would extend this to the panel. And I'm really challenged in this space. Charlotte has a Black mayor. We have a Black chief of police. We have a Black chief of the fire department. We have a Black city manager. We have a white female as the county manager. We have all this gender and racial diversity in I would say, in our community. But we still continue to have these conversations around our poor race relations, and the economic disparities are clearly defined according to racial lines. So I'm always struggling with how do we explain this to someone who is in Charlotte, but let alone someone who's coming from outside of Charlotte and questioning how are y'all having these problems with these people of color and this diversity in such leadership positions? And then we'll start with you.
Look at where we live. Look at the map of racial segregation in Charlotte, and you'll get a lot of that answer. The reason, and I know this because this is where I live, right? So I'm in the belly of that beast. I'm in South Park, Charlotte, in the $1 million house neighborhoods. And I think everyone in this area, because they never go anywhere but South Park, and it's that I'm going to say it really directly because you said to be honest, that rich, powerful white cone of wealth that descends from downtown Charlotte. And if that's your bubble, you think Charlotte's absolutely fine. You're not going to the West Side. And I think there's this belief that everything is fine because that's the bubble they live in. And when you live in that little bubble and you don't live with the diversity in the city, I think that is so much the root cause of our problem, from the education system to that sense of empathy that we talked about, to wanting to be one city and living with your neighbors. And it's just, until we solve that issue, I think we're going to have a lot of these other systemic issues.
I think, Dan, you're spot on. And if you go even further, you named a lot of folks. I mean, Black mayor, blacks everywhere, chief of police, Black fire department. I mean, fire chief. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, when I was in the court system, Black chief magistrate, Black chief district court judge. I mean, it was a 100% blackout. Before I moved to Charlotte, we lived in Detroit. Detroit was a blackout. And so I think there has been an up and down over the last probably 20 to 30 years. You look at New Orleans, you look at DC, you look at Baltimore, you look at Philadelphia. All these cities have had an influx of African Americans that have gotten to positions of power, either elected or appointed. But it won't erase 250 years of slavery. It won't erase, 50 to 60 years of secondary effects of slavery with Jim Crow, redlining. I mean, all those types of things are still there. And so again, another quote from John C. Maxwell, all things rise and fall on leadership. So if you have these folks that are in these positions of power, but they're folks that work for them still look the same, still have the same thought process, still have the same systems in place, and still live in those same bubbles that Dan talked about, with those blinders on, that they only see what they see and only know what they know, and aren't driving on Tuckasegee and aren't going over there to Independence far off or North Tryon. So in their mind, Charlotte is great. Economically, we're prosperous. Business is booming. But 75% of the business is going to predominantly white businesses, with 11% going to minority businesses. So obviously we have, as I mentioned before, a huge disparity. But when you start putting folks in place that can understand that, hey, there's a disparity, and now what can I do about it? I need to start making sure that it's a priority, not for us to have a 25% inclusion, which only means that I got 25% minority applications, but I have a 25 to 35% granting of those applications. When you raise those numbers and you start to look at them from a different perspective, I think you start to get different outcomes. But if you got a 33% inclusion and you're only getting 11 to 9% application granted, then there's the problem. So I think our numbers need to raise, not just for inclusion. And I don't know how to do that. There's not a magic ball that says, okay, now you can start making it mandatory, because there's some discriminatory practices with attempting to do that. But I think there are smarter folks than me that can come up with ideas and ways to ensure that we get an increase in that, and not just inclusion, but the granting. I served on the Small Business Entrepreneur Board with the county. They thought of ways to try to increase minority participation. And I think some of the things they talked about was great. Ensuring that folks have their paperwork together, they have their business practices in line, ensuring that they are actually have the potential to be a profitable business, and then making sure that someone is willing to take a chance on them, again, is that intersection. And sometimes that willing to take a chance on them doesn't happen. And so now you have this business that's thriving, that needs capital, that needs opportunity, and just doesn't get it. But those first two things have to happen, where they have to have their paperwork together. I think resources like SCORE are great for putting businesses in a position to be successful. And I just think you have to have folks that want to take advantage of that don't feel like, okay, I got to do it on my own, from the business perspective. Because I think, as you mentioned, we have those elected officials there. And I know, like Councilman Mitchell, it's his mission to ensure that if I have an opportunity to help an African-American business, I'm going to put them in the right position to do that. I'll connect them with the right person on the city level that actually is going to do the work to help guide them through the process. Is folks just have to take advantage of those opportunities, for sure. And the onus is not on them by all means. It's those folks in those positions that have to start recognizing that there's a huge deficiency, a huge gap.
I love where this conversation is headed. This is absolutely what I wanted this conversation to evolve into. I see a lot of engagement on our Facebook page. Thank you, Taylor, for making sure that these questions are being funneled. I want to just ask a couple of questions that are coming through, if I may. One of them is, how can you hold the politicians accountable when they are constantly playing politics with the issues in people's lives?
Well, that's the name of the game. So in law school, my professor that taught me ethics, she said, if you don't know the rules of the game, you can't play it. And I didn't make the rules. They were already in place before we all got here. And so our two-party system was established, and it is politics. That is the very name. But you all have an individual vote. And so your vote can either make someone move out of the office or sit in that office. And so if you believe that that person is not being truthful, if you believe that that person is not working to your best benefit, and has your interest at heart, then you want to make sure you vote that person out. But I'm not making it seem like it's an easy thing to do. That wealth distribution or lack of wealth distribution plays a part in that. If you only have $12,000 in wealth per African-American family, then you obviously have less money in terms of disposable income, which means you'll have less money to give to candidates. And so that's a huge conversation that I have with candidates about when you're talking about African-American candidates and raising money. Look at Kyle Cunningham, for instance, in that U.S. Senate race. He raised $28 million in the third quarter, $28 million. Jamie Harrison in South Carolina raised $58 million. Now, and the reason that both of them could raise so much money in that one quarter is because the whole country recognizes that those two races are extremely important. But most African-American candidates' fundraising dollars pale in comparison to their white counterparts. And so if you're asking back to those blinders, people that live around you to give and people that you know to give, they're giving the $50 and the $100. And not saying that can't be successful. President Obama did that on a huge level. Micro donations is what extremely helped his campaign. But most African-American candidates aren't doing that. They're getting $50 contributions, $100 contributions on a lower level. So then their white counterparts are doing it, again, fundraising wise on a higher level. And so what I can say is, and I don't say that response to be quick, as if I don't understand what they're asking, but I do want folks to recognize that everybody first has to vote. And if you're voting and you feel like someone is playing politics with the issues that affect you, then vote them out.
Thank you for that. Did anyone else have anything to add to that? Shania?
I have something to add to that, and that is, I've been hearing this conversation all my life, and that's been a long time now. I'm an older woman, Um, and I think that the message that I like to give people is you need two things in an election. Two things, not just one, not just money, but you also need votes. And for me, growing up in poverty, like I said, we always voted. The thing that I did not have until very recently was understanding that my sisters and brothers don't have the same level of understanding that I do around voting.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Black people must get involved in a party. We must begin to lead in these parties, and we must be able to set the agenda. The vote is the last part of the process. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
first part. It is the final straw. You got your people in line, they follow your agenda, now you're ready to vote. We're upset now because we weren't in the beginning of the process, mobilizing our people, establishing a Black agenda, bringing that Black agenda to the forefront to these two-party systems that are designed supposedly to represent us. We didn't get a play in that beginning. I'm not saying don't go vote, but what I'm saying is when our mayor stands up and she says something to us, who is she really talking to? Because we
Mm-hmm.
weren't in the beginning of the process. Now she's out saying, hey, vote for me. Well, that's the end of the process. You missed your opportunity to tell her, Sister Vi, this is what we need, this is what we want. And we may not have money, but we got 10,000 votes that you will not get. But we have to have that education and that experience as voters to recognize that now we're at the back end of the process. And I'm telling y'all, don't sit at home and not vote. But what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying is let's learn something from this time. And come January 1st or November the 4th, the day after election, go out and get involved. Join a campaign. Find somebody in your community who you can stand behind. And that's something else we didn't talk about. Start helping with these campaigns. You learn about politicians, you learn about their personalities, you learn about how this works. And then too, African Americans need our help in this area. We need strong campaign managers and people who understand the data and analytics behind campaigns and people who are willing to go and do those personal touches, knock on doors and phone bank.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to get involved in the process before the vote. The vote is the last part. So that's all I'm gonna say on that. I ain't gonna take up no more time.
I can make one quick comment because I totally agree with those thoughts. And I'm going to say something, and Manuel, you may cut off my mic, but I got to say it.
Please do.
Consequences of not realizing what Shmia just said. We have a white supremacist as president of the United States of America. It has to be said. And that is the consequence of not understanding that. And that is why people are so desperate to disenfranchise people of color from voting in America. They understand, Khalif mentioned the rules of the game. They know the rules of the game, and they are playing it as hard as they possibly can. And that's the intersection of business and race in here, is that we've let less than a third of the country, in essence, elect the president of the United States for their agenda, and it's disenfranchised 2/3, right? What was it, 40% of the people that were eligible to vote didn't vote. We have to change that.
Thank you for that, Dan. That was amazing. And then Shemaya, I appreciate your perspective from your background, also as a campaign manager in the past. So that was great. We have another question I want to make sure we kind of get answered here. The question is, what about a few key local and state policies? Many of us are not in the position to influence national level politics in a substantial way. But as a Charlotte community pulling together and focusing on business owners, what are a few local and state level policies that would help?
They ask better questions than I got.
Got some savvy people on.
I can say a couple things on the local level, things that I'm supporting. Obviously the bond, the housing initiative bond that's being pushed out from the city, $50 million. I sent over a letter to the city council offering my support, but I cautioned them in terms of the way they look at it. Again, back to the wealth development. Most of that money is earmarked for renters. And so my request is, how do we make sure that money is used for ownership? So I asked them to set aside a certain amount of those dollars out of that 50 million and make sure that now you'll have ownership as a priority in there. And that wasn't an original thought by me. I put Bobby Drakeford, I appointed him to a committee, and his committee included Cadis Berry, Will Hughes, Jessica Davis, and they all kind of came together and thought, well, this is something, an initiative that we need to push forward and try to figure out, well, how isn't this a priority? Again, something in the African-American community that we see as a problem, wealth development, but we're going to throw money at something that will not create wealth at all for that community. If you're a renter, you are creating wealth, but it's not going to you. The wealth is going to someone else that owns that property. Another initiative on the local level that I'd say is something called source of income discrimination. It's been in the backgrounds in terms of conversation with city council. Obviously, they don't have the ability to make a mandate, but they can pass an ordinance. This is something that needs to pass on the state level. So on the state reps and state senate side, you can speak to all of those folks. You can speak to your city council person at large or in your district, and to your state reps about source of income discrimination. Basically, it says there are folks in our communities that are discriminating against people for where their money comes from. So if you get your money as some type of grant, or if you get your money as part of some type of federal program, I'm going to tell you that you're not good enough to rent this property from me, which again is problematic in a city where folks are already struggling to find places to live. So I would say that those are two issues that you can put put your efforts behind. But to the original question, I'll say this: just because you don't feel like you have an impact on those federal races, those national races, let me go ahead and help you. You do. You have a vote. And so you can vote in the 9th Congressional District if you live there for Cynthia Wallace. You can vote for Congresswoman Alma Adams in the 12th Congressional. You can vote for Kyle Cunningham in the U.S. Senate race. There are folks that you can vote for right now on this election that will change your life on the federal level. So all of those folks will have an impact, but in terms of initiatives, those are ones that I could say will directly impact you on a local level.
Great, thank you. Great insight again. I love the panel and the thoughtfulness that you guys are really bringing to this conversation. The thought leadership is very impressive. And I'd like to actually transition a little bit and kind of focus again back on the small business community. And in particular, there was an article that came out in the Charlotte Business Journal, actually on Tuesday, where it really talked about the access to, in essence, microloans to small businesses in Mecklenburg County. And in the journal, they calculated loan totals and dollars deployed in majority Black versus majority white census tracts in our community. And based on their research, they found that even though the loan amounts were the same, both majority white and majority Black neighborhoods, the loans extended to those businesses in those communities was roughly around $16,000. However, the number of loans to majority white in the majority white tracts was 3 times higher than the number of loans in the majority Black tracts. So businesses that were based in tracts along kind of the wedge, if you will, of Charlotte were 3 times more likely to receive a loan than those that were in more of the crescent. And so as we kind of continue to have this conversation really around access to capital, race, business, and really politics, access to capital is always the issue that continues to surface. And what are some things and what are some steps? Khalif, you mentioned kind of being a part of the county and their small business initiative. Dan, I know you're a part of several different organizations that invest in some way, shape, or form into smaller businesses in the venture space, but also just kind of being passionate about the small business ecosystem here in Charlotte. And Shemaya, sounds like you're a small business owner yourself. What are some steps and what are some things that we can do or need to be doing to really emphasize and help businesses? Because without the necessary capital and or the business development opportunities, which is basically us going out and support, the wealth distribution as it currently exists will remain. And we need to take some necessary and specific steps in order to address this problem. And any proposals or suggestions that anyone on this panel might have?
my issue is, I'm a nonprofit organization. I do consider what I do a business. I have to have some of the same skills, some of the same everything that everybody else does, a way to bring in money and build capacity. We've been in the build capacity stage for quite some time, and we're finally to the point where we are writing grants and things like that. What people need to really understand is, don't get it twisted. The nonprofit world is a business. And as an African American led nonprofit, it is going to be very unlikely that I will get major funding. Why? Because only 2% of Black led nonprofits actually receive major funding. The reason why this is problematic is because you're already in a community where you have all these needs, concerns, and wants and all of this kind of stuff, right? Nonprofits may not be able to turn over a profit, but you can pay people to do things. It is a separate economy in and of itself. And if we don't have our major foundation, hint, hint, in this community, not willing to fund the things that are very important, that we see that are important, we're missing the mark there. Here's a good example of how this plays out. So if I'm a small nonprofit and I'm knocking it out the park as far as my results, as far as how I'm connecting with the community, establishing a good economic development plan, a housing program, whatever. When I go for major funding, they don't want to fund what's actually important to my community and what's bringing results. They want me to scale. And then when I scale and get all this money coming in, suddenly I'm not as effective for the community, but all of the people and the clients who need the services will come to me because I've gotten all of this money.
Mm-hmm.
You see it happen over and over and over again. And so from the perspective of philanthropy, we actually really do have a major problem in Charlotte itself, because we have only a certain few people who dictate what's important to the community that they don't even live in, haven't worked in, don't understand. We're connected to it. We could hire 10 or 12 people, give them a living wage because we are a nonprofit and have raised that money, but we're not able to move the needle there either. So just as a small business who's for profit has an issue, so does nonprofit organizations and Black-led organizations, because we can't build our economy around that either.
Mm-hmm. And Shamaya, that's an amen, a head nod, a jump up and scream and shout from Aspire Community Capital that's putting on this amazing Aspire conversation. That certainly feels the pain of really being able to raise funds sufficiently in the nonprofit space. Khalif, Dan, either of you have some insight to add around the access to capital?
I have one thought, but Khalif, you want to go first?
All you, Dan, all you, go ahead.
I want to connect a couple dots that Shamia said to what she just said, back to the comment on reparations for a second, because and we talk about capital. Einstein said the most powerful force in the universe is compound interest, right? You probably all heard that. Well, the most powerful force in the connection of business and race is compound privilege. And it's generational privilege and generational wealth creation that is not going to solve itself, even with a $15 wage or a livable wage that we're advocating for. And when at least for me, and I'm curious if people disagree with this, when I think about reparations, it's how do you give that access to capital to correct that generational privilege that we've taken away from people, right? Some people got it because we took it away from other people. And there has to be a recognition of that fact, or we're never going to be able to move forward. And I know that's a controversial subject for a lot of people, but it was joked. Ruth Bader Ginsburg made this point of how many women is it appropriate to have on the Supreme Court? And she said 9, and people gasped. And it's like, well, for 250 years, we had 9 men on the Supreme Court, and you didn't seem to have an issue with that. Same thing with CEOs. Look at how many Black CEOs we have. Look at how many Fortune 500. Look at how many female CEOs we have a Fortune 500, right? This isn't a history of the past. This isn't an issue of the past. This is an issue of today, right now, as we sit in America. And we've got to recognize that.
What about you, Khalif? Do you have anything to add to that?
I don't think I can add any more to what Dan just said. That right there was excellent. I mean, the recognition of the issue was probably more problematic than anything. And it's not an easy conversation to have where folks have to step outside of their comfort zone. Sometimes stepping outside of your comfort zone may cost you money because an opportunity that you had access to that you maybe shouldn't have is given to someone else. And I area, that's definitely a very, very hard conversation. And so by all means, what he said, I couldn't have said it better.
And Ty, I would just add, it's interesting, Dan and Khalif and Shamaya, that when I'm in conversations around this topic and there's a lot of pushback around the reality that there were race-based policies that created our current situation. And why do we assume that for whatever reason, race-neutral policies will get us out? So it's just an interesting dichotomy that exists just in terms of our mindsets right now and the perspective that we have around how we got here relative to the perspective about how we get out of this.
Absolutely.
Beautifully said, Manuel. And that's a great transition into our final leg of this segment, which is the call to action. And so I just want to say thank you once again to all of you and to all the folks who are on Facebook Live, chiming in with your comments. They are giving you all lots of love out there on the thread. I'm just going to kind of summarize some of the things I heard you say throughout this conversation and maybe ask for an extension of maybe 3 to 5 minutes. We might go over 1 o'clock if you have it. So we have getting people out of poverty. Politics and income are the key. There is racism of indifference that we need to deal with. A higher minimum wage level, and not just livable minimum wage, but a higher minimum wage, and reparations for descendants of slavery and healthcare for everyone. And then also the surrounding of community, not feeling like you are alone in the process, and getting involved in campaigns. So of some of those things and highlights that were mentioned, where do we think the 1 or 2 action items are that we really want to have as kind of the stabilization of what we do to move forward? And that's for everybody to chime in.
I can say, Taya, one of the things that and Shamaya, I greatly appreciate your insight around this. I don't think that there's enough involvement that we have in the electoral process throughout the year. Like we tend to only get involved when it's an election coming up every 2 years or, going into the 4th year for the presidential election, where in reality, we should be involved in politics as part of our life because it affects every part of in everything that we do. So Shamaya, I really appreciate you bringing that to the table as, a point of entry and engagement that we all should have.
Mm-hmm. I can definitely see that being a call to action. Was there anything else that really stuck out for you all that you feel we should be using to move forward? Dan, vote, yes. Early voting is happening now. Started the 15th of October, going through the 31st, and then of course election day is November the 3rd. So definitely get out there and vote. No reasons not to.
So Dan, go ahead, Dan.
No, you let me go first a couple times, please, go ahead. All right, the one thing I'll say for me personally that is interesting, I think we all have a unique position to play. And I recognize the personal privilege that I was born with when we talk about the differences in our background, right? White, male, in America, to a wealthy family, 2 parents, both college educated. There is not a lottery ticket that if you were going to look for a privilege that probably doesn't look a lot like my lottery ticket of birth. And I think that comes with a great responsibility to understand what you do with that. And I've worked really hard to try and be in a position where I can influence people. And for me, it's that, and you can see that, hopefully you can see that passion of what position are we all uniquely in and what unique things do we need to go do. And my thing is challenging white men of privilege and wealth to start understanding and recognizing some of the truths of this. Just a small personal example, we took our kids to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson, to understand the conflict of this man who everyone thinks is a great American hero, and maybe you could argue he is, but at the same time owns 600 plus people as property. And his wealth was created from owning slaves. And as much as he talked about being a terrible institution, he didn't free him. That's how he built his wealth and power. That's why he was in a position to be able to do that. And we got to start having honest conversations. That's not an anti-American thing to say. That's an honest American thing to say. If we can't start having those conversations, we will never get past this and through this as a country to where we need to be.
So Dan, I think excellent segue for what I was going to say. And see, that's why I defer to you right there. You teed it up for me. And so I got a couple things I'll say in terms of calls to action. So first, I often talk to candidates about this, and I've been shifting the conversation to voters, but it's an easy thing to go from activists to candidate. And it's really hard to go from activist to candidate to elected official. I think you see it with Braxton Winston, where he was out there in the street, enraged by the process. And now he's on city council trying to make, policy changes that the folks that got him there want him to do. For voters, it's the same way. You go from activist to being frustrated. Okay, this is not happening. I can't believe this is occurring. So I'm taking my frustration to do my constitutional right to protest and voice my concerns. But then there's a second step, there's a next leg, and that next leg is oftentimes forgotten, and that's that voting process. And I will say, I think you guys mentioned it earlier, the vote is the last part, but I have to overemphasize and double down on my comment that it's extremely important that we look at the financial contributions. When I was a candidate, I really appreciated when someone said, "Hey man, I'm voting for you. I love it." That made me feel great. But I already know I got your vote. What I need more than you is your dollars, because your money can help me get someone else's vote that doesn't know me, that doesn't already support me. It helps me get radio and potentially TV and social media and anything else that will help me garner someone else's vote. So it's extremely important that as African-American candidates, if we want to see that needle pushed even further to more folks being elected, that we're at that breaking point and tipping point where folks need to give for these candidates to get to those next level positions that they're attempting to get to. But the reason I said Dan teed it up for me is because he talked about awareness. And Dan, you seem very aware. The younger folks would say Dan is woke for sure. Definitely in tune with his identity as a person, but also in tune around him for the various issues that African Americans are facing. And so I thank you for your comments. But I'll say, what is your next leg? So in corporate, I tell folks all the time that I often am brought in to speak to them about these diversity and inclusion issues. And I'll say, it's great that you've made this public statement that your company stands with Black Lives Matters and my company is, for diversity and inclusion. But then when I look at these individuals, senior level executives and folks that are right underneath them, it still looks like it looked prior to their awareness. And I have not done any type of examination of your company at all, Dan. But I will say that what I would tell you, like I tell any other business owner, that it's that next leg, that when you become that vision that other folks should see, because I am inspired by what I've heard today from you 100%. But when folks see that next step, which is, I don't want folks to put up an ad when you could have just went out and hired with that ad money 10 or 20 executives to support it, internally. And so a company I've worked with recently, Boston Consulting, they put a few $100 million behind an effort to stop voter purging. And so when I talked with their senior level execs, they said, listen, we wanted to put our money behind what we were outraged by. So I was extremely excited for that opportunity. But I even told them, I said, most of the folks that you guys have pushing this initiative don't look like the very folks that are being affected by these voter purging in Florida and in Carolina and in Georgia. And so they took that as constructive feedback. Feedback is often a gift in the corporate space. And they said, listen, I appreciate you making that comment. We'll figure out what we can do to address those concerns. But I'll say that there has to be a progression. And oftentimes we hover in that awareness space and so for my call to action is for folks to figure out what their next leg is. And even me, I got to figure out what my next leg is in terms of, okay, I've done this education and outreach for folks to vote, and that's great. But what's the next step so that I can ensure that the things that I'm talking about are accomplished? So that's where I leave it.
Thank you very much for that, Khalif, and all of you. I'm going to summarize some of the calls to action that came out of today's session. One is to be involved in politics as part of your day-to-day lives. Don't wait until it's time to vote. Definitely vote. We, of course, are doing this with federal people, but even on the local level, those things happen every single year. So make sure you're getting involved and finding your place and having the people to be involved on a regular basis. Sacrifices, okay? These are uncomfortable conversations. You're going to have to go and do some things you haven't done before to get to a place you've never been to before. So you're going to have to meet new people, talk about new things, and have conversations with people in ways you haven't. It's okay. It's a sacrifice. It's the way that we have to get things done in this economy and in this ecosystem. And then awareness. Know what, as Khalif said, what your next leg is. And I love that you said that even you, with all of your experience and where you are in life, are trying to figure that out. So thank you so very much. Manuel, thank you for allowing me to do what I do for so many people in this community through your platform and being such an amazing leader for Aspire. Shamaye, Dan, Khalif, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be part of this panel. You left so many amazing nuggets. Maybe we can do another session after the election to talk about some of the things that people should be following up with. All of you on the Facebook Live page and who will listen to it later, we appreciate you. I also want to just make sure I recognize Start Us Up, which is part of the Kaufman Foundation's initiative, who sponsors this series for us. And then, of course, all the other community partners, the board, the team, you all are amazing, and we couldn't do it without you. Go and be amazing today. Go vote. Do make sure we follow through on these calls to action, and we will see you soon. Peace and blessings, everybody.
One last comment, and Khalifa, I just want to share with you that Aspire Community Capital also provides excellent services as well as programming for small businesses. So we certainly look forward to you referring anyone who you know, along with SCORE, that needs any type of assistance in our space.
I definitely will. I definitely will.
Excellent, excellent.